here. My name is Mark Dunkelman. I'm a fellow at Taubman. And Jim Marone, who couldn't be here today, asked me to introduce Andrea, who is an old friend from my 13 years in DC. So I'm thrilled to do it. And I'm thrilled that she's here for really two reasons. One is for those of you who are interested in public policy. Andrea is the graduate of an august public policy program who went on to work at the National Governors Association, inside the White House, and is now has a long tenure at one of the more successful stories about of a nonprofit in DC, of an advocacy group that's got boots on the ground. So it's a career to model. And the second reason that I'm thrilled to be here is because some of you may have noticed that there is a figure on the public stage these days who is telling everyone all the time that everything is a disaster, and that only he is prepared to fix it. And while that's sometimes sort of a little bit funny and a little bit scary when we hear him say it, it actually sort of betrays a broader truth, which is that American faith in institutions of all sorts is flagging. And that's true both for Democrats and Republicans, independents, everybody. And that's true not just in politics, but it's true of churches and educational institutions and businesses and small businesses. And there are very few institutions that have maintained majority esteem. The military, the police sometimes, small business sometimes. So one of the reasons that happens, even at a moment when people think that actually the country, some people think the country is doing better than it has, is that we only hear stories in the press about disasters. And if you pick up the Providence Journal today, you'll see on the front pages it complaints about schools that are testing poorly. Or if you, Andrew probably hasn't seen this, but we've just moved to a new system, a new computer system for social services here in Rhode Island, and there have been a bunch of glitches, and there is sort of this sense that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but if all you hear about is squeaky wheels, you begin to believe that you got a lemon. I think that's happened. But what we've got here is a story that Andrea's going to tell you of a public policy success. And she's got her own theories about why she's been successful and why the story of teen pregnancy is what it is. But I hope that it is for the audience some sort of window into amid sort of constant barrages of stories about how things are going poorly. Here's a story of something that went well. What can we learn from it? How can we apply these lessons to the variety of challenges you guys are focused on in your own research? So anyway, please welcome Andrea Kane from Washington, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here. I was just saying, this is my first time on the Brown campus. My brother and sister-in-law actually both went to Brown and met here, so I'm very grateful to this campus for having connected them, and I now have 3 wonderful nieces and nephews as a result. But it's kind of amazing. I've never been here, so it's really great to be here with all of you, and I appreciate the invitation and everything that went into getting me here. So what I want to do today, and I hope that we can keep this fairly informal, is I really want to weave together 3 things, and I hope they come together fairly coherently. One is what's going on with teen pregnancies and births in this country. As Mark said, it really is an amazing success story. The second is, what role did policy play, and what can we learn from that about how policy and policymakers can make a difference on really big, tough social problems? And then the third is, what role did the organization that I work at, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, play in that success? And that in itself is an interesting outgrowth of the role that policy can play when we think about policy in sort of a broad sense. So just a little bit first about our organization, because that's sort of a requirement. When you work in an organization, you want to make sure everybody knows who you are. I've had the good fortune to be associated with this organization for 16 years now, and it really has been a joy. How many of you have heard of the National Campaign? Oh, wow. Yeah, got ringers over here. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We were founded in 1996. You'll hear the story of our founding shortly. Our goal is to, sorry, I've got two different things going on here, there we go. Our goal is to improve the well-being of children and families, and that's, a broad goal. Probably half the nonprofits in America have that goal. The question is, how do you choose to tackle that goal? What's your strategy? And our strategy has been to focus on reducing teen and unplanned pregnancy. Now, when we started in the first half of our life, we were focused only on teen pregnancy, which is defined as people up through age 19. And as I'll tell you a little more later, halfway through, in 2007, we expanded our mission to go up the age scale, and we now also focus on reducing unplanned pregnancy among young adults. So we now kind of think of our target population as basically up through 30, so including all of you guys. The reason that we do this work every day is because we know that the circumstances under which people get pregnant and children come into this world are really at the front end of a lot of other things that we all care about, whether it's making sure people get education and skills so they can succeed in the workforce, so they can have strong families, so that we can have fewer children in the various systems like foster care and juvenile justice. It's obviously also at the front end of abortion, which is a very divisive issue in this country. I don't need to tell you that, but if we can make progress on reducing teen and unplanned pregnancy in the first place, we can make progress on lots of other things that lots of people care about. So it's really almost like a force multiplier when you think about it. So that's just a bit about us. So now, let's just to set the stage, let's look at the trends. I mean, we're sitting here looking at one of the biggest, probably public health and social policy success stories in a century. When we were still in the last century, people said of that century. Now that we're in the 21st century, people would say this century, but I don't think it'd be fair to claim 2 centuries. If you look at it, teen birth rates have fallen 64% since they peaked in 1991. I mean, that is, in the words of Joe Biden, a BFD. It's really a big deal. And I think they've fallen every year with the exception of 2005, 2006. Just a little blip, and we don't really know why that blip happened, but luckily it was only a blip. I think a couple other things to mention about this progress. First of all, it has been widespread, it's been universal. We have seen progress in every single state in this country. We've seen progress among all ethnic and racial groups. We've seen progress among younger teens and older teens. We've seen progress in rural areas and urban areas. So this is not just an isolated phenomenon. This really is something very profound. That said, we still have a lot of work to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In particular, we still have a lot of unevenness and disparities, and I think that is going to be a huge focus of our organization going forward. Just reflecting on the most recent drop, you can see that from 2008 on, we saw a really steep decline. Sarah Cliff, who writes for Vox, some of you may read her good articles, said the reduction in teen births is arguably one of the biggest public health victories of the 21st century. It's rare to see such significant changes in a health metric in just a few years. Imagine if obesity rates, for example, tumbled 40% in 7 years. I mean, that would be amazing. So that is just some indication of really how much we've collectively accomplished. Obviously, it's teens themselves that are changing their behavior, and that's really who deserves the credit for this. The rest of us are there just to sort of catalyze and support them in making those better decisions.
Andrea, can I
Sure.
remind people, the title of your slide was 1940.
Oh, that's a typo.
That's what I thought, and I just wanted to
Thank
point it out
you.
to you.
Sometimes we show it from 1940, sometimes we show it from the peak in 1991. Thank
Yeah.
you, good catch.
No, well, it wasn't really a catch. I was trying to figure out what I was missing.
Nothing at all. Whoops, why is this now not? Oh, it is, I see it. I'm going to add. Okay, sorry about that. So what does that progress mean? It's very abstract to look at the chart. I think this is one helpful way to think about it in terms of real people. In 1996, 4 in 10 girls got pregnant at least once before they turned 20. So we have, 25, 30 people in this room. 3 or 4 of you would have gotten pregnant if you were all girls. A decade later, that number had declined to 3 in 10, which is good progress. And now in 2015, which is the most recent year for which we have data, we're down to 1 in 4, roughly 1 in 4. It's probably actually a little under that. So we have seen huge progress in the lives of real people in this country. And if you think about that in terms of numbers, now you all are very sophisticated, so you know the problem with looking at numbers is that doesn't adjust for population changes. But if you look at it just in terms of absolute numbers, almost 500,000 teen births in 1996. We're now down to about 230,000. So even adjust, when you think about the population increase, that's pretty amazing. So that's just the stage setting trend. Now let's roll back the clock. Hope you like my old-fashioned clock. To the late 80s and early 1990s, which I realize is maybe before some of you were born. But at that time, teen pregnancy had been going up, and it was being talked about as a crisis, a national epidemic. It was, it was just in the conversation, the public conversation, with a lot of concern. I remember this really well. I was living in Houston at the time. I was working at the local job training program, and I remember reading a book by a Washington Post reporter named Leon Dash, who wrote a book called When Children Want Children, The Urban Crisis of Teenage Childbearing. And he spent, I think, 2 or 3 years really trying to understand what was going on with teen pregnancy in Washington, D.C. So it's an ethnographic research. I remember being blown away by the book, and not having studied public health or thinking that was my career path. I was really working on poverty and job training and sort of more economic opportunity. But saying, after reading that book, I want to learn more about this. I remember going to visit a program serving teen moms in Houston, and saying, gosh, at some point I would really like to work on this issue. And it's kind of amazing that, fast forward, here I am, and I would never have imagined then that I would have had the incredible fortune of getting to work at the White House on these issues, and then at the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy for the last 16 years. So you never know what a book can do to change your life. So people, as I said, were really struggling with what is going on with teen pregnancy, what's going on in young people's lives, what do we do about it? And it was also sort of against the backdrop of, I think, a larger recognition that society was changing. We were seeing growth in single-parent families, non-marital childbearing, sort of a sense that maybe families were changing. A lot of people were troubled by that. Researchers were beginning to look at the issue, policymakers were beginning to look at the issue, governors were beginning to look at this issue, including governors like the Democrat Bill Clinton from Arkansas and Republican Tom Kane from New Jersey, and their lives will meet again later in this story. But what we weren't seeing yet was any sort of national consensus about the issue or real national leadership saying this is something that we need to understand better and figure out what we can do about. And we also weren't seeing yet any sort of policy solution to this, which is appropriate because I don't think people really understood the problem enough to begin to use the policy levers. So when we think about public policy, we think about policy levers, there's a lot of different ways that public policy can work, right? You all are smart, you're learning all this every day, I'm sure. I think some of them are very obvious, things like public funding and investments, legislation, regulations, administrative guidance, and implementation of programs. Those are the things you more traditionally think of as public policy. Obviously, I don't have on here judicial action, but that's another important one. But I think one that we don't think about, sort of underappreciated, is the power of the bully pulpit and the power of influential policymakers to convene people, to get other people to do things, to catalyze larger action. And the story of the decline in teen pregnancy and the story of the national campaign is really in that domain of sort of the power of the bully pulpit and of convening. The other policy levers have come into play to some extent over time, and we can talk about that, but I really want to zoom in on the bully pulpit. So in So the ultimate bully pulpit the president has is a State of the Union, right? And a couple of very, very smart policy wonks working at the White House in 1995 said, you know, we want to see if we can engage the power of the presidency to really look at this issue of teen pregnancy and see what we can do. These were mostly folks working at the Domestic Policy Council and OMB, and they had the brilliant idea and were successful in executing it to actually get something into the State of the Union on this. Now, I don't know how many folks have sort of studied the process of developing a State of the Union, but there is intense competition for real estate in the State of the Union. I mean, to get like 3 words in there, you know, people hire lobbyists to try to do that. I mean, it's a really big deal. And because, you know, millions and millions of people are watching it, and it sets an agenda for an administration for the coming years, and sometimes for Congress too. Oftentimes in the State of the Union, you'll hear calls for funding, for legislation, for executive action, but sometimes you'll hear things that are really, again, about just using the bully pulpit to catalyze action. So in the 1995 State of the Union, the president said, we've got to ask our community leaders and all kinds of organizations to help us stop our most serious social problem, the epidemic of teen pregnancies and births. Tonight I call on parents and leaders all across this country to join together in a national campaign against teen pregnancy to make a difference. So this was not very specific, but it was just this general call to the nation, sort of a call to action. Fun fact is that line about the most pressing social problem got more applause than any other line in the State of the Union. So clearly it sort of struck a tone with the public and certainly with Congress. Now, presidents don't put things in the State of the Union without knowing what they're going to do afterwards. There is a whole lot of planning that goes on and making sure that anything that's announced, there's a whole strategy for how it's going to roll out, what's going to happen next, and that was certainly the case here. So by the time the next State of the Union rolled around in 1996, this group of people inside the White House had joined forces with some folks outside the government and to come up with a very detailed prospectus and plan for what this national effort might look like. They consulted with people from all walks of life around the country, identified key leaders who could actually be on the board of this organization, and began to line up some private funding. Because from the beginning, the national campaign was never funded by the federal government, much to the surprise of a lot of people. The president and the first lady were instrumental in helping to recruit all kinds of influential people to be involved in this effort against sort of the power of convening, especially when you're in the White House. These included Democratic and Republican former elected officials, influential media partners. We had Whoopi Goldberg, we had the head of MTV at the time. MTV was very young then. We had community and religious leaders, just a really diverse group of folks. And in the 1996 State of the Union, as you can see on this slide, the president basically was able to report back that this effort he called for a year before was about to be launched.
Do you mind sort of ad hominem comments, just sort of backing you up?
Sure.
Beginning
As
about,
long as I'm gonna keep a little eye on the time, but yes.
it's only going to be 30 seconds.
Sure.
Beginning in 1991, and for most of the 90s, I was on the board of Rhode Island Planned Parenthood.
Oh.
And this was Planned Parenthood focuses on mostly on teens and young women who can't afford to go to a private OBGYN. And what you're talking about was what we were concerned about from 1991 on, from that time that I was on the board. So,
Thanks for the validation.
yeah. Thanks for the work you did.
Thank you. Okay, so you see we sort of got to report back in the State of the Union the next year, and then right after the State of the Union, the president brought everybody that was involved in what was about to become the national campaign to the White House. Another thing that presidents like to do, they have this meeting in these beautiful rooms in the White House, everybody feels very important, and you know, when the president or the first lady say show up for something, gosh, people get on a plane and they show up. It's pretty amazing. So everybody gathered together in a room and shared what might this new national campaign look like. And A few days later, I wasn't part of the campaign yet, they had their first board meeting and we were born. We were off and running. I think what's really important is, up on the slide, I won't read the whole thing, but the fact that this was a serious, nonpartisan effort, this is a statement that the White House put out at the time, to mobilize many sectors of American society, business, entertainment, media, religious leaders, and others. In other words, again, this was not just the government. The president said the government can't do this alone, and he was right. And also that the statement said the Clinton administration worked to help get this going and promised active support, but it was never a governmental effort. It was always independent, and I think that has allowed us to really survive and thrive across different administrations and sort of withstand the test of time. We didn't live and die by one administration. Although we're very grateful for the support that we got then. So the question was, how was this organization, this tiny little organization, it literally started being housed in essentially a broom closet at the Urban Institute with I think 2 or 3 staff. How is it going to take on this problem that it was massive? And we have a big country, a diverse country. How are we going to do this? I was just going back in preparation for this speech and reading the original prospectus that our founders put together, and I have to say that they were pretty visionary and prescient. The things that they said we should do back in 1996 pretty much have withstood the test of time. They're pretty much the things that we have done. And when I say we, I mean the campaign has always been a catalyst, but we don't do this by ourselves. We're working with people all around the country in many different ways. So this diagram is something that we use for a long time to kind of show how we work, and just want to hit on a couple of points because I think they, again, show some lessons in sort of how to change social problems. One is that from the beginning we have been research-based, data-driven. And that doesn't just mean looking at what works, but also having data constantly inform how you work, because things are always changing, right? Young people are changing. Techniques are changing, technologies are changing. From the beginning, we always knew that we needed to get outside the sort of narrow space of reproductive health and health generally. Not that that isn't super important. Groups like Planned Parenthood and many others play a vital role in actually making people get health services they need. But we need to broaden the tent to also include business leaders, faith leaders, media leaders, parents, all these other people that can make a difference. From the beginning, we knew we had to understand our target audience. Sort of obvious, I know, but a lot of people will work on something like teen pregnancy and never actually ask teens what they think. So we had a youth advisory group from the very beginning. We've done a lot of polling, we've done focus groups, and this has been instrumental in keeping us honest and informing our work. And then from the beginning, we have had great respect and tolerance for diverse viewpoints. We've not only been bipartisan, but we've been a true big tent. I would say that has gotten harder over time as the country has become more polarized. It certainly makes the public policy part of my job very interesting. But I think it's been really important, and we've tried to model, I think, how you can disagree agreeably and how you can have respect for different viewpoints, and that there isn't a single answer on these really, really complex issues. And then, we knew that we weren't going to be out in Providence and in Austin and in Sacramento doing the work. We were really there to support and be kind of connective tissue for all the people on the ground doing the work. So a huge part of our effort over the years has really been to help people on the ground do what they do more effectively so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've done that by providing research, technical assistance, ideas, convening, connecting them to each other, sometimes even providing a little bit of funding when we had that to give, but really sort of building a movement in a way. And then I think this is probably one of the more complicated parts of the organization, which is that and I think the president's statement alluded to it, this issue is deeply rooted in people's values and beliefs. It's not just a health issue. It's not just about how people act. It's what they believe. It goes very, very deep, and we know that different faith communities have different views on these issues, different parents have different views on these issues, and we have sort of always understood you couldn't ignore that. And so we've tried to embrace that and really try to find ways that people could talk about this issue within the context of their values and their faith. And again, that's not easy, but we felt like it wasn't something you could just kind of sweep under the rug. So that's just a little bit about sort of how we've worked over the years. You will notice that public policy is actually not on there, which I think is interesting. I started at the organization in 2001, and we at that point really started to build our public policy program. For the first 3 years, we didn't have one. We had put together a group of bipartisan congressional advisors, but they were there more again as a bully pulpit sort of role. We weren't advocating on particular legislation. I think we sort of had to figure out what we thought was needed before we went about advocacy. Since then, federal policy advocacy and state policy work has become a really important part of our role. And something that you saw in the president's statement and has been a key, I think, to our efforts and those of people around the country was that we set a very bold goal. People thought we were crazy at the time, but we said we were going to try, that the country should try to reduce teen pregnancy by a third. We met that goal as a country, which was kind of amazing, a third over a decade. So in 2005, we met that goal and said we got more work to do, so we set another bold goal of reducing teen pregnancy by another third, and it looks like we are on track to meet that goal. Some of you may have noticed I've been going back and forth between teen pregnancies and teen births. Our goal really is to reduce teen pregnancy. The data on teen births is much more current, so we tend to use that as a proxy. The teen pregnancy data lag. And if I had a chart where I had both of those on one chart, you see that they're going down exactly in tandem, which is what you would want to see, because you could drive down teen births simply by having much higher rates of abortion. That's not what's happening. We're actually seeing fewer teen pregnancies in the first place, but like I said, we tend to use births as a proxy just because we have better data. So just to kind of stop and review the bidding for a second, just with some key milestones. So we've talked about the State of the Union in '95, talked about us getting launched in '96. A lot of things happened along the way in society and in technology and in youth culture that have really changed how we've done business. So and I think have contributed in important ways to the progress. So I just want to review a few of these. First of all, the whole world of technology, the internet, computers, phones, all of that was changing rapidly at the same time. When we first started, we said we don't do direct services, we don't reach teens directly. We're here to support the other people that do. Well, with the advent of the internet and people being able to go online and get information, we now do reach teens directly. And in 2002, we thought we were so cool because we launched the first national day to prevent teen pregnancy with this online quiz. And this was so cutting edge. And I think if you went back and looked at it now, you'd think it was pretty lame. And even that is interesting how it's changed over time. We went through then a period of using avatars and all these things. So we've sort of evolved as technology has evolved and as teen culture has evolved. 2005, we celebrated our 10th anniversary. Again, announced that we'd achieved our first goal. Wise students of history will know that by this time we were in the Bush administration, so we were working in a fairly different political environment. And we survived. We had to work in different ways. We didn't work as directly, certainly, with the White House, but we had a good working relationship with the administration. We could find places where our issue could tie in and fit. In 2007, this was a big change for us, and we won't spend a lot of time talking about this because I really want to we're mostly talking about teen pregnancy today, but we expanded our mission, as I mentioned earlier, in part because we were making so much progress on teen pregnancy, but we weren't seeing progress among sort of the 18 to 30-year-olds when it comes to unplanned pregnancy. And we thought maybe, and some funders thought maybe we could take some of what we were learning and apply that to that older population. So that was huge organizationally. We changed our name, we changed our mission to some extent, we changed our strategies because we had to figure out how do you reach 18 to 30-year-olds, which is very different than how do you reach sort of younger teens. On the policy front, we saw the first ever federal investments in evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. That started in 2010 and has continued. I think that's contributed to the success. In 2011, in part to try to reach our young adult audience where they are, we launched something called Bedsider. Does anyone here know about Bedsider? Okay, by the time everybody leaves here, you will. So Bedsider, again, using technology, is I can say this because I didn't create it, is an incredibly innovative, effective, brilliant way of providing information about birth control to young men and women, basically sort of 18 to 30-year-olds. Check it out. I hope you use it, enjoy it, tell your friends. But this really was using the state-of-the-art technology, social media, to reach people where they are so they get the information they need to make good decisions about birth control. So that was a huge change for us, sort of getting into that space. In 2015, President Obama actually acknowledged the decline in teen pregnancy in the State of the Union, so that was another nice milestone. And then this year, 2016, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, so we have been around 2 decades. We can say we're no longer teenagers. And you know, with that, it's an opportunity for us to sort of reflect, say, what have we learned, what have we accomplished, and what's left to do. And I'll talk just a little bit about that in a second. So I just wanted to kind of put all that in some historical context. So as I said, when the Obama administration came in 2009, the issues of teen pregnancy came back a little bit more to the fore in terms of federal policy. And the way that President Obama really has focused on this, I would say, is a little bit more of a traditional policy approach, using more of a traditional policy levers, really in terms of mobilizing federal funding, legislation, guidance, program implementation. As some of you may know, one of the things that President Obama ran on was trying to return to a time when we use science and evidence to guide policy. And so that's been a theme throughout his administration, and the teen pregnancy area has been sort of one of the jewels in the crown of that move towards evidence-based policy making. As you can see in this chart, there was actually a dramatic shift in how funding for teen pregnancy prevention in this country is directed. So we could have a whole wonky policy discussion about this, but just to keep it sort of at the high level. In 2008, there was about $163 million, that was at the end of Bush administration, dedicated to federal funding for teen pregnancy prevention education. All of that was focused on abstinence, and none of it had any requirement about evidence or evaluation. It was very sort of ideologically driven. President Obama came in and said, we are going to use evidence to inform our policy making, and was successful working with members of Congress in shifting that through 2 federal funding streams. One that goes out to states primarily, called the Personal Responsibility Education Program, and one that goes out to communities through competitive grants called the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. So by the end of 2010, in this very short time, really in its second year in office, we went from having no funding focused on evidence-based approaches to teen pregnancy prevention to having $190 million focused on that. That was a sea change. I mean, it's still a tiny amount of money in the scheme of things, but it was a big change in emphasis. That has been a huge focus for us, helping to get that money going and fighting very hard every day to protect it, which is no small thing, but for the most part, it has continued. You can see that by 2016, I should have said in 2010, there was still $50 million for abstinence programs that had started in the 1996 welfare reform bill and basically continued. By 2016, that actually had grown a little bit. Republicans in Congress last year were successful in increasing that, but at the same time, the amount for the evidence-based programs has continued. So I'd say overall, a very good news story in terms of public policy, driving funding towards things that have evidence and evaluation and research and results behind them. It's not perfect, but definitely we've come a long, long way, and this administration deserves huge credit for that.
Can you just take a second and say what I'm struggling with? What could be a non-evidence-based something.
Oh, well, for the funding for abstinence education that was started in 1996 for abstinence education was entirely based on values. And I don't mean that values are a bad thing, but it basically said all funding should have as its exclusive focus teaching the value of abstinence outside of marriage, and then had some very like prescriptive sort of values-laden
Kind of
statements.
like just say no.
Yeah. But there was no requirement that funding be evaluated. There was no requirement that it actually work. It just went out on faith. And I'm not denigrating it. I think there were well-intentioned people that thought that that was the right way to go. But unfortunately, there was never sort of a parallel effort to say, does it actually achieve its desired outcomes? And the research that has been done since then has really shown that for the most part it doesn't achieve its desired outcomes.
Yeah, I'd be the person in the room denigrating it.
Yeah. We're always trying to model that respectful behavior. But we've learned a lot over the years. So that's sort of what we've seen on the funding shift, and I just want to show you what show you what that means in the real world, because these things do always have real world consequences. This chart's probably a little hard to see on the map, but what this investment in federal funding for evidence-based teen pregnancy under this administration has meant is that we now have millions of young people around the country that are actually getting high-quality evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention programs. Just one of the funding streams, which is shown on this map, is on track to serve about 1.7 million youth over 10 years. There's the other one that isn't on this map is serving roughly the same number. Again, drop in a bucket, very small number, but a huge step. And I think what's also interesting from a sort of a policy lesson standpoint is that this federal investment has, I think, had outsized repercussions in states and communities because it's become sort of like the gold standard. So people in states and communities, when they want to do something, even if they're not getting federal money, they look to the federal standards as this is how we should do it right. These are the programs we should use. They're not just sort of making things up at the kitchen table.
Can you comment on I'm having a little trouble reading it, probably my glasses aren't on, but the blue is the states that are receiving funding, federal funding?
Yes.
Okay. And is Rhode Island, it's really hard to see on those
Oh my
maps.
goodness.
I'm just curious whether we are or not.
I think you're not with this funding stream, but as I said, there's another funding stream, $75 million a year that goes out to every state, and Rhode Island is getting that money. This competitive grant that's shown in this map is super, super competitive, and Rhode Island either didn't apply or didn't make the cut. We actually have profiles on our website that show what every state's getting if you're interested.
Yeah.
Thank you. So now remember that chart that I showed you at the very beginning with the trend? I think one of the most remarkable things about that trend, and this chart zooms in on a little bit better, is that normally when you see progress on a tough issue, it starts to plateau over time. I think one of the most amazing things about this success story is that the progress is actually accelerated, which I think has honestly kind of surprised the heck out of us and a lot of other people. We keep thinking it's going to tail off, but as you can see in this chart, or maybe you can't because it's kind of small, but between 2010 and 2015, there was a 35% decline in the teen birth rate in 5 years. That is twice as big as the decline in any other preceding 5-year period. That is stunning. Now, of course, the question is why? President Obama recognizing the progress. So this is the question that we really don't have a convenient, neat answer to. What is behind this progress? I think you will see a little bit to Mark's point, you'll see people making claims about maybe what's behind this progress. But I think if anyone says they have a simple solution, I would ask twice. It just isn't simple. As a research-based organization, we've tried really hard to understand what's driving these trends, and I think we are humble about what we know here. I think partly because what's driven the trends at different points in the last 2 decades is different. So for example, during the recession, there was a steep decline in the teen birth rate. Everyone said, oh, it must be the recession, people are being more cautious. But the decline has accelerated since the recession, so that theory may have been right during that time, but doesn't explain the whole picture. In the early 90s, a lot of the decline, people believe, was because of fear of HIV and STIs, driving more cautious behavior. You probably saw that at Planned Parenthood. And particularly, we saw a big increase in condom use among guys, right? They're going to be more motivated maybe by fear of a disease and fear of pregnancy. You know, as concern about HIV has tailed off, maybe some of that urgency has gone down, but again, the teen pregnancy rates have continued to go down. The MTV effect is something that people talk about a lot. I think we use MTV as a bit of a shorthand, but I think all of the work that we and others have done with the media to embed thoughtful discussion about teen pregnancy prevention in the media, in TV shows and magazines, social media, we believe has made a difference. I mean, young people consume way more media than they do sex ed, right? So just even by sort of length of exposure, you would think that that would make sense. I think our hunch about that has now been borne out by research that was done, really, really interesting research done about the effect of the MTV show 16 and Pregnant and Teen Mom. I don't know if you guys have seen this research, but they actually, 2 researchers actually found that they contributed to as much as 1/3 of the decline in the teen birth rate during the period that those shows have been on. We think there's something bigger going on here, though, that's really cultural and sort of a matter of norms. And it just seems like, and I'd love to know what you all think, especially those of you who are not too far away from being teenagers. You know, it feels like the norm has shifted from the fact that, you know, it's sort of like not a big deal if you get pregnant as a teenager to it being a pretty big deal. Like, it's sort of just, it's not the norm anymore. And that doesn't mean that there aren't situations where people make that decision very intentionally. But for the most part, that norm has changed. We also think that there's sort of a tipping point. So if one of the biggest predictors of being a teen mom is that your mom is a teen mom, and we now have fewer teen moms, then just demographically, you're going to have fewer girls that are at risk for that. And then so you start to see a tipping point there. So, and then I would, you know, add to that, that we just have a lot more action going on around the country. We have states and communities, cities, community-based organizations that have taken this issue on since that 1995 call to action. All those things, you know, add up, but we can't isolate any one factor. So I would love to just hear, you know, what you all think is behind the decline, because we're always looking for answers.
Just kind of the first thing up there, more and specifically better contraception. I know specifically looking at the work done in Colorado and the increased use of long-acting reversible contraception, and whether those methods in increasing the chance or decreasing the chance of human error in various like birth control techniques, the benefits seen there, as well as like on a much more like state-focused level, states that have made moves much more recently to have birth control available over the counter. So those like very clear, both long-term decreasing human error moves and these moves to make just contraception much more available, much part of like everyday life.
Yeah. I would, you know, I think it's really interesting is yes and. I mean, the focus on long-acting reversible contraceptives, low-maintenance methods of contraception, that started, you know, a couple of years ago. I think it's, you know, it's beginning to now get out there, and it is true when you look at the states like Colorado where there was a real intense focus. We saw some of the biggest declines in recent years. I would say the second one is so recent that it probably isn't affecting the rates yet, but it will be interesting to see if it does. Yeah.
I was wondering if you did any research on the effect of, speaking of contraception, of Obamacare and like more insurance and sort of if that's impacting things?
Right, I think we will see, I think the answer is yes, but probably we're only seeing the very front end of that, especially if you think about teens, right? Because the way that mostly would have affected teens is if their parents were uninsured and they're now on their parents' plan and they're insured. I think that certainly has affected some teens, but I think we'll see more of that in the next couple of years as that really plays out. I think what it certainly has done for those who want to get access to the more effective methods of contraception, like IUDs and implants, which are more expensive, it has taken the cost barrier away for those people. So I think that probably has been, that would be an area. I mean, the research hasn't been done on that to see how this affected teen pregnancy yet in a really in-depth way, but I think one could hypothesize that that's made a difference.
I wonder too if there's not like a telephone effect going on. I know that when teens talk about relationships and talk about sex a lot, and a lot of the rates of teen pregnancy were lack of education. And as education gets better, then they talk about their friends, and it's sort of this information dispersion that happens, and that has a domino effect as well.
Absolutely, and that's part of what I think what we mean when we talk about norms and just it's peer influence in a positive sense.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think technology has facilitated that, right? Because there's ways to say, hey, I saw this website that's got great information, check it out, you know. Yeah, absolutely. I know we are getting short on time, so what I want to do is
There's a
just...
question.
Oh, no. Thank you.
What?
I had another idea, but please continue.
What I want to do is just sort of tell you, fast forward, where we are now, which is, 20 years in, we're not done. We actually asked ourselves last year, we put out a report called Go Home or Go On. The question was, do we declare victory and move on to something else or not? The answer is obviously we're still here because we still have a lot of work to do. Our teen pregnancy and birth rates are still higher than any other industrialized country, even with all the progress, which is kind of amazing. We still have huge disparities. This map is one of my favorite ways to show the disparities because I think it shows the teen birth rate disparities, not just by geography, but if you think about what's sort of underlying that geography, there's also a lot of socioeconomic disparity and also racial and ethnic disparity. So that is a huge focus for us going forward, is to really try to narrow those disparities, because we can't continue the overall progress if we aren't paying particular attention to those areas where the gaps are the biggest and the needs are the greatest. So that is, as we sort of sharpen our focus for the next decade, that's really a huge focus. And then we will also be, we have also set a goal of reducing unplanned pregnancy among 18 to 20-year-olds by 25%. That is a very ambitious goal. We only saw the first ever decline in that, in unplanned pregnancy, in the last couple of years. I think that's where Obamacare is going to really make a difference if it continues. But I think we're starting to already see the effects. So I just wanted to close with a couple of the things that we have learned that I think are applicable to other social policy challenges and issues. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to turn my back to you guys. There we go. And I think, we've touched on a number of these already, but I think to be bold, for the president to say something that may not have been politically popular at the time or may have been controversial, but to just sort of get out and say, this is not okay, we need to do something about it. For our organization to sort of take some bold stances, I think has been very important. To engage powerful voices, realizing, whether that was the president, media leaders, business leaders, I think no one can do this by themselves. To set these bold goals and know that you might fail, but having those bold goals really motivates people and keeps you going. To be innovative. I think this is especially important because teens' lives and teen culture changes so fast. So we are constantly trying new things. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes these things we try just don't work. And we say, okay, try that, move on. I think that's a place where it's harder for government. Government isn't as nimble and good at innovating as nonprofits, so it's nice to have this sort of role for the government and then the role for the nonprofit and private sector. Following the data and the evidence, again, everything from learning where the needs are the greatest and how the population of teens is changing to really investing in things that work and finding out what doesn't work. being nimble, as I said, I mean, you know, being able to turn on a dime, again, as you see needs change, as you see opportunities rise, again, that's something that's a little harder for government to do, but private sector and the nonprofit sector can be helpful there. Really listening and learning from the target audience. And again, that can be done in many forms, whether it's focus groups, research, surveys, one-on-one, but it's very, very important. I think recognizing that complex problems require multifaceted solutions. I mean, we don't have a single magic answer to why the teen pregnancy rates have gone down. We shouldn't be surprised because it's a complicated problem. But that also requires some humility, I think, and sort of resisting the easy answers. Recognizing, respecting, and engaging diverse perspectives, as we talked about, not always easy, but I think in a country as big and complicated and diverse as ours, necessary. And then sticking with it. You know, we've been here for 20 years. I think we couldn't probably have survived this long if we were part of the government. And so I think we've enjoyed this wonderful partnership with the government, support from some administrations more than others, but have been able to sort of withstand the test of time. And I think these problems take a long time and you have to just kind of keep on them. So that's where I would end. I want to just actually tell you about something that we have that I hope you all would participate in. This is a little off the topic of the decline in the teen pregnancy rate, but in the spirit of meeting our audience where they are, being bold and innovative and trying to change the conversation. A couple of years ago, we started a national social media event, I guess you'd say, on this year it's on November 16th, called Thanks Birth Control. And its goal is really to have a positive conversation. It goes exactly back to Mark's early point. You hear so much bad when it comes to birth control. You hear much controversy, fighting, all the side effects, all the bad things. But birth control has made a huge contribution to almost all of our lives, I would say, and it's widely used, it's widely supported. It actually isn't controversial with the public. And we felt like we needed to say that. We needed to shout it out. And so we have engaged people from all walks of life. Students, Hillary Clinton tweeted something last year, the entertainment figures, all kinds of people. And we just ask everybody to join us on November 16th in whatever way makes sense for you. We've got great t-shirts, as you can see. Those are some of my colleagues. That you can order and take a selfie. We have all these fabulous e-cards and many more, everything from G-rated to R-rated. We have sample tweets and Facebook posts, and we would love to have you all join us and spread the word with your friends and family and fellow students. So check it out. And with that, I will give you my contact information and invite you to stay in touch, and happy to answer any questions if we still have time.